Chapter 14, Speciation and Extinction. Chapter 14, Speciation and Extinction. What's a species? Well, defining what a species is not as easy today as it used to be because we know a lot more about species. Species arise over millions of years. And sometimes they split quickly, sometimes they take forever to become a new species. For instance, between Australopithecus and Homo sapiens, there's about 330,000 generations. Basically, small evolutionary changes have accumulated through the last almost 4 billion years, leading to today's great diversity of life. These small mutations, even if numerous, produce new species. First, we have to define a species. It began in 1700, a guy named Carolus Linnaeus. He kind of developed the science of taxonomy, and he defined species just by what they looked like, appearance, the morphological characteristics. He also created a filing system or a naming system to organize all of life. Each species name combines the broader classification. There's genus and species, and then it goes up. There are families and orders and etc. But this isn't where we're going to talk about taxonomy. We talked about that earlier. Basically, let's look at a scientific name. Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus. The genus is always capitalized, whereas the species, sapiens, is always lowercase. Also, scientific names are always written in italics. So we are members of the species Homo sapiens. There was Homo habilis. Okay, there were several species of Homo, some of which existed together early on. But the other species of Homo were outcompeted by Homo sapiens, which had a larger brain case. This larger brain case gave them certain advantages in survival, and they outcompeted the other species of Homo. More recently, we developed what is called the biological species concept. A species is considered a group of animals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And there are stages to where that will cease to exist. There are certain things that can occur that will keep members of a species from breeding with each other, and that is the first step towards speciation. Speciation is just the formation of new species. It's when some individuals can no longer interbreed with the rest of the group. Reproductive barriers can cause speciation. Let's say two tectonic plates ram into each other, like happened at the Rockies or in the Appalachians, and they raise a mountain chain. This mountain chain will divide a habitat, isolating some organisms of a big population on one side of it and some organisms from a big population on the other side. And a mountain range changes the habitat. Usually, on the eastern side of a mountain range, you will get what is called a rain-shadowed desert. And the mountains, depending on how tall they are, will block moisture from getting past the mountains. We can see this in the American Rockies. The coastal regions of California are very lush, and then you go over the mountains and it turns into desert. Reproductive barriers, there's several types. There's habitat isolation. In this case, that would be animals of the same species are separated by their habitat. In this case, we can look at these ladybugs. For some reason, one group of ladybugs chose to eat off of one type of plant, while the other species chose this type of plant. Now, over time, the population of ladybugs that eat this plant, and they never go over to eat this plant, they will diverge. Genetic mutations will start occurring. Different genes will turn off and on the various genomes, and this will lead to ultimately speciation. You can have temporal isolation. This is where breeding seasons are just not the same. There are field crickets that breed in the spring and summer, while there are field crickets that breed in the fall. And even though they might be able to reproduce if they interbred, they won't, because they become fertile at the wrong times of year for each other. Behavioral issues, courtship activities. Frogs call to attract mates. The males call, the females respond. So when the males call, the females of its species can find the males. Now, in most species of frogs, the females can only hear the calls from the males of their species. Mechanical isolation. Sometimes the mating organs just don't fit. Sage species can use different pollinators. Okay, in order to pollinate this flower, you're going to need this species of bee, and in order to pollinate this flower, you're going to need this species of bee. And so this, what started out as one species, will separate and isolate over time. And then there's gametic isolation. Gametic isolation just means that the sperm and the eggs cannot unite. The ovum can't be pierced by the sperm, and therefore they can't make a zygote. Now, all of these actually are pre-zygotic. These are all methods in which a fertilized egg is never produced. Post-zygotic. These are reproductive barriers that occur after the fact. Okay? One is hybrid inviability. When two different species of closely related organisms breed, the seedlings are not viable. Basically, the seeds, the fertilized eggs, will not grow into adult plants. There's hybrid infertility. Infertile means that, for instance, you can breed a lion to a tiger. Now, if you breed a male lion to a female tiger, you will get a liger. If you breed a male tiger to a female lion, you get a tigon. Regardless, they can reproduce, but their offspring are always sterile. They can never reproduce. And then there's hybrid breakdown. Second generation hybrid offspring have reduced fitness. Okay? So they have abnormal genitalia. They can breed. These two different species of mosquito can breed, and their offspring can breed, but the offspring, which would be the grandchildren of the original pair, can't breed because their sexual organs, their genitalia, undergo disconformity. Basically, they malshape in the congenitally before they can reproduce. Post-zygotic reproductive barriers prevent basically the offspring from becoming fertile eventually. Sometimes it takes a couple generations. Special or spatial patterns, there's two types. There's allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric speciation, a barrier separates a population into two groups that can't interbreed. There's no gene transfer, like a mountain range. Okay? Other things that have been known to happen. Let's say you put a major 4-lane highway through a large forested area. An original one species can't really cross those highways and survive. Not to mention that usually big 4-lane highways, they have fences on either side, so it's impossible for wildlife to get across unless they can find a bridge. With no gene transfer between the two populations, each will proceed down its own little evolutionary line. And they have done that with bacteria. They will take a bacterium and separate it, isolate it genetically, and they will mutate differently over time, and eventually they'll develop into new species. Spatial patterns. Galapagos Islands. There's all kinds of tortoises on the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are basically, they're owned by Ecuador, and they're a series of islands that came from volcanic activity. And over time, parts of the islands have become habitable, but then there are also parts of the island that are still just volcanic glass. You can't even walk across it with boots very well. It'll just slice brand new boots to pieces. And at one point during the last ice age, it was one big island. Okay, and so tortoises developed there. And then as the ice age receded and the big glaciers melted, the sea level rose and it became a series of islands. And all of these different tortoises were isolated on different islands. And they've had plenty of time to evolve and adapt to their particular circumstances. And now they can no longer interbreed. Sympatric speciation. This is where populations diverge genetically, but they share a habitat. We have several cases. There was a case in the Balkans where an island that had a lot of insects on it, they introduced lizards there. They were going to do a study on lizards and population ecology. And they took the island and they calculated how big it was, and they calculated the biomass, and they figured, okay, this island should be able to hold this many lizards. So they set a few lizards go, and they were going to watch it and see what happened. Then the Balkans War, Yugoslavia broke up and into multiple little countries, and it got too dangerous to go visit the island. They weren't able to visit the island for almost 10 years. And when they came back, there were too many lizards based on their model. And so they caught a bunch of lizards, and what they had found is that one group of lizards continued to eat insects, but a second group of lizards had started eating plants. Now, originally the lizards were insectivores, but the second part had become herbivores, and so they stayed higher up in the bushes and trees eating the vegetation, while the insectivores stayed on the ground, and they became reproductively isolated. And it had gotten to the point where their shapes had started changing. The ones on the ground had shorter legs. The ones up in the trees got a little larger legs, and they were on the road to becoming speciated into two distinct groups. And here's Lake Malawi. Lake Malawi is a African rift lake. Okay, the rift is full of water from the last ice age, and it is in a rift that came about because of tectonic shifting of plates. And in this lake, there has been a tremendous number of species arise. And this is sympatric speciation. And these are behaviorally cued to only breed with their own species. And we're still discovering new species there. Here is, they're all little species of cichlids. Some of the cichlids are primarily herbivores, and some are predators. There are micro-predators and there are macro-predators. The fish here that you're seeing are mostly mbuna, and mbuna means rockfish. And these species eat primarily algae and plant matter. And then there are predators mixed in there that will eat the baby mbuna. And then there are open water predators that will lure the mbuna out and eat the adults. Now, there's an interesting thing going on here with these Malawi cichlids. It's such a competitive environment for food that most of the species secrete hormones that inhibit the growth and size of their conspecifics, all the other types of fish. So they're constantly at this biological warfare trying to keep each other small. Here is just along this, there's Tanzania and Mozambique. Here is Lake Malawi, and they're mapping all the different species and species complex along the lake shore, because as you move down the lake shore, it changes. Now, there are certain areas that become inaccessible because there are frequent wars and guerrilla activity, and so maybe one side of the lake you don't want to go to because they'll kill you, and then one side of the lake is safe. Let's see. Now, here are some of the big open water predators. These are haplochromids. That's Murai, that's Venustus, that is, it's not polystigma. What is that? Anyways, like this one, And this one, now the males get like this when they're breeding, and the big humps indicate a very dominant male, okay, and he's got the most testosterone. But these open water cichlids will go and lay down on their sides on the bottom of the water, and they're blotchy, and they look like they're decaying. They look like dead fish. And the mbuna will come out to try to get a free meal, and then they hop up and eat them. Here are some melanochromas. These are little micro predators. They don't get as big, and they mix in the rocks and crevices, and they try to get a hold of the baby cichlids. And here's some typical different species of mbuna rockfish. There's Pseudotropheus zebra and etc. There literally are hundreds of species that are collected. And for freshwater, they're very colorful. Here is an aquarium with an adequate number of hiding spaces for the offspring. Now, this is one of the few exceptions to the rule that you don't want to overcrowd an aquarium. Basically, African cichlids do best if they are overcrowded. That is their natural habitat. You just do a lot of water changes, and in captivity, these fish get much larger than they do in the wild. Here is another lake in Africa near Cameroon, and they have reproductively isolated. They all come from one group or population of fish, but over time they've exploited different niches. And because they've exploited these different niches, they have isolated and become behaviorally, reproductively isolated. California king snakes. This is another species in which basically they are one species, but they are reproductively isolated because in some areas they have different color morphs that provide better camouflage. And so you can go out into the wild, and in one area you'll find these banded black and white king snakes, and then there's the same species that's in another habitat that is banded brown and white. And then there are some species, some individuals of this species. This is all one species. There is one individual that are striped, and et cetera, et cetera. And these are highly protected in California. So you want to be careful. You don't want to go picking any of these up if you're out there. Polyploidy. Sometimes two species that are introduced. Okay, so let's take the cotton plant. There is a cotton plant that they made cotton from in the old world, meaning Africa, Asia, like that. And then the New World is South and Central America. And in the process of developing the cotton planting industry, the two were introduced, and they interbred. And what they did, the offspring, now this is the normal number of chromosomes each species would have, but since they crossbred, the offspring have more chromosomes than either parent, and they will produce, and some of these hybrid forms of cotton are very desirable for producing massive amounts of cotton on the bloom, and then that cotton is harvested and refined and turned into clothing. Two types of speciation have been recorded in the fossil record. There's gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism just means that things change very slowly over time. Here's the root species, and for whatever purpose, they became reproductively isolated. Then there's just little spots where new species pop up, usually after a catastrophe of some sort. Something happens that kills off a lot of competing species, and then the original species will expand to utilize the resources in habitats it was outcompeted in originally. But now that the organism that lived in that habitat utilizing those resources is gone, it can now spread to that area. And as they basically exploit these new resources in these unique habitats, they'll speciate. In that case, they will quickly produce a large number of species from a base species. Here is mammals. And there's a period where the number of mammal fossils increased dramatically. Okay? Now, up until, this is the Mesozoic, this was the age of the dinosaurs. And the dinosaurs were pretty good at competing and keeping mammals in check. You know, the mammals arose from therapsid reptiles, and they were plunking along here in the fossil record. Not a lot of species. They tended all to be small. They tended to be burrowing. They were very secretive animals. And then the meteor hit at the KT barrier, Cretaceous and the Tertiary. They now have changed that to the Cretaceous, or rather the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic. But the big dinosaurs all died out. The small dinosaurs survived and eventually evolved into birds. But with the big dinosaurs gone, that was mammals' chance, and that's when we see the number of mammal species just expand. Okay, huge numbers. There have been several large extinctions in the fossil record, and we can't explain them all. The first one was back here at the Precambrian. All right, there's here is the Mesozoic. This is the one where the dinosaurs died off. And we see a lot of rapid speciation after that because the animals' resources never go to waste in nature. So if the animals that originally used them are gone and not using them anymore, something else will. There's the impact theory. We have enough data now to know that the meteor did hit the planet at the end of the Mesozoic and made the large reptiles, or rather the large dinosaurs, go extinct. And the way we know that is iridium. Iridium is this mineral that's found only in meteors. However, wherever we can access rocks between, in this part, this would be the Mesozoic, and above it is the Cenozoic, we find this little layer of compacted iridium. So this meteor was so large that when it vaporized, it sent, basically, it spread huge amounts of iridium around the entire planet and blocked the sun, all that debris. And it slowly settled into this little layer that was covered over by soil and silt later. And so you can just find this little straight layer in geological formations anywhere where you can access rocks that are this age. Plate tectonics, Earth's shifting land masses. Okay, this can explain some mass extinctions. Now, humans are changing, so the biosphere is being altered by us, and that is leading to a current mass extinction. We are killing tremendous numbers of species, are going extinct, especially of amphibians. Okay, take this. This is Manhattan. Now, in 1600, when people were first from Europe were first visiting these areas, this was just a forested island. Now it's the most expensive real estate in the world, as far as I know. We're also deforesting large areas. We're doing agriculture in large areas. We are altering the biosphere, the habitats, massively. Basically, between the Mississippi and the eastern coast used to be one solid forest. It was just one big hardwood forest, all the way from the Mississippi River all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And so we have been altering our environment here dramatically. And we're seeing a lot of species go extinct. Species now are going extinct primarily because of loss of habitat. And there are some species that are called endemic species, meaning they're found only in one place in the world, and they have a very limited habitat. Like you might find this species of salamander in this one cave in the whole world. And so if you pollute that cave, they die, they go extinct. Now, why do we not want animals to go extinct? Well, as we're learning more about genetics and we're mapping genomes, we're finding all kinds of useful compounds that will benefit our lives in medicine and many other areas. And so each species that goes extinct, we lose those genetics forever. Here's taxonomy. This is biological classification. This plant, aloe vera, its species is aloe vera. The genus is aloe. Okay? And there's about 500 species in that genus. They're in this family. They're in that order. And the class, phylum, kingdom, domain. Domain eukarya means that our cells have a defined nucleus that's bound by a nuclear membrane. Plantae, they're all plants. They're anthophytes, etc. Now let's put humans in there. Okay? So Homo sapiens, our genus is Homo. Our family is Hominidae. Our order is Primata. Our class is Mammalia. Our phylum is Chordata. Our kingdom is Animalia. And our domain is Eukarya. And each one of these, as we go higher up, includes more and more species. And right now there's about 1 million named species, and we are still finding new species every day. Okay. Phylogenetics is the study of evolutionary relationships among species. And so these are breaks. When they branch like this is an event, okay, genetically. And so we can actually, as we get more and more genomes of species, we're developing these cladograms, or phylogenetics. So these are 10 species that show their relationship to each other. Now, you can look at this and go, okay, species 1 is least related to species 10. It's most related to species 2. Okay, so these are very closely related. Now this guy, both of these are pretty equally related to this. All three of these, this clade had an event there that in which mutations or something occurred and they split and it became this species and then these 3 species. And so you can look at this, and based off of descent from common ancestors, this is giving us a lot of really good knowledge into species and where species came from. Genetics has given us the ability to sort out some groups of species that we were never quite sure how they adapted. So these are different clades. So here's the birds, are the most closely related to the non-avian dinosaurs. And then their next closest relative would be the crocodilians. And their next closest would be the lizards and snakes. And then the turtles. And then the mammals. Now, at this point, we look at the mammals. Here is where the therapsid mammals came in the evolutionary chain. And then you have the amphibians. So a clade is just a group of organisms consisting of a common ancestor, and these little branches are the common ancestor. Okay, so there was a species here that split into 2 different species, and one went and evolved towards turtles, one went and evolved towards these animals, and you can see these speciation events when new groups arose. Tracing taxa back to common ancestors reveals their evolutionary relationships. And according to this cladogram, a bird is more closely related to a dinosaur than a crocodile. And we have tremendous amounts of evidence and data now to support that, to the point that that's become part of evolutionary theory. That'll wrap up our discussion of Chapter 14.